Be me anon. Work at a mid-sized tech company. Content department. Decent job, nothing special. Pays the bills and leaves enough for rent and groceries with some left over. The office is the kind of place where everyone pretends to be very busy even during the stretches when nothing is actually happening. Open floor plan, rows of monitors, a kitchen that smells like someone is always in the process of reheating fish. I've been there long enough to know the rhythms of the whole place. Who takes the long lunch, who never refills the coffee maker, who you do not engage with before 10 in the morning. That last category is where I mostly live. I need a cup of coffee and about 45 minutes before I'm prepared to have a real interaction. Most of my coworkers know this and respect it. Open floor plans teach you a lot about reading people fast. 2 desks down from me sits Morgan. Content manager, 28, the kind of person who treats every opinion she has like it belongs on a motivational poster. Not a bad coworker in the straightforward sense. She does her job fine. She meets her deadlines. She doesn't steal lunches from the fridge. But she has a blog, posts about feminism, toxic masculinity, social issues, the general landscape of modern grievances. About 4,000 followers, which she mentions roughly once a week in casual conversation. Sometimes more if something she wrote got picked up or quoted somewhere. We got along okay, mostly because I nodded a lot and asked minimal follow-up questions. That's a skill I developed after years of sitting in open offices. You learn which conversations you can afford to engage with and which ones you need to exit gracefully. Morgan's conversations required a specific kind of careful nodding. You had to nod like you were genuinely interested, but not so enthusiastically that you invited more detail. It's a fine line. I had calibrated it pretty well over the months we'd worked near each other. So things were steady, professional, fine. Then one day, everything changed in the specific slow-motion way that only happens when someone decides they've had a revelation. She came in looking focused in a way I hadn't seen before. Not deadline-focused, which is anxious and involves a lot of tab switching and muttered complaints about Slack notifications. This was different. Calmer, almost serene, like she had resolved something internally before she even sat down. She opened her laptop and started typing with both hands, like she was transcribing something important that might evaporate if she stopped. Didn't look up, didn't make small talk, just typed. I figured she had a big project and went on with my own morning. Around midday, I was getting coffee in the kitchen, and she came in right behind me. Started talking before I'd even finished pouring, which is something she does when she's excited about something. Said she'd been working on something really important that morning, something that was going to fundamentally change how she approached her romantic life. I said that sounds significant. She said she'd made a list, a requirements list, for what she needs in a partner. I said most people have deal breakers. That seems reasonable. She corrected me calmly. Said this wasn't deal breakers. Deal breakers are reactive, she explained. You tolerate things until you can't anymore, and then you leave. Standards are proactive. You establish what you need before you even let someone into your life. I nodded and said that distinction made sense. She said she'd been dating for years, and the core problem was that she'd never written any of it down, never made it concrete or explicit. So men sensed she was flexible on her needs and pushed past things that should have been clear limits. Now she had removed all the ambiguity. She said a man who was truly aligned with her values would read the list and feel nothing but respect for her clarity. I asked, as casually as I could, how long the list was. She said 73 items. I poured my coffee and said that was very comprehensive. She said she could have gone longer, but kept it focused on the essentials. I went back to my desk. That evening, I got a message from a friend with a link and a string of laughing emoji. Then another message from a different person, same link. Then a third, No message at all, just the link, which somehow communicated something the laughing emoji didn't. I opened it, Google Doc, titled at the top, in bold, Non-Negotiable Partnership Standards. Formatted like a real document. Table of contents, numbered section headers, items numbered within each section. She had put genuine effort into the presentation, and I want to acknowledge that because it actually was well formatted. I read the whole thing start to finish, which in retrospect was a mistake, but at the time felt like something I had to do. You know how sometimes you start reading something and you think you'll stop partway through, but then the specific nature of it keeps pulling you forward. This was that. The physical requirements section opened with minimum height of 6'1". Then athletic build, described with some specificity about visible muscle tone. Then a separate item about no dad bod energy, which I noted was distinct from the athletic build item. So technically 2 items about approximately the same thing. Grooming standards, dress standards, no visible tattoos below the collar. I counted 8 items in the physical section total. The financial baseline section was where things became interesting in a different way. Minimum annual income of $120,000. Must not have co-signed any loans for family members. Must have an active investment portfolio and be able to discuss investment strategy. No financial entanglements with any former partner. I sat with the 0 student loan debt item for a while. In this country, at this specific moment in history, that requirement alone eliminates a very significant portion of college-educated men in their 20s and 30s. The median student loan balance in America is somewhere around $30,000. The 0 debt requirement is not a high bar. It is a bar that exists above the statistical average, and the income threshold is not a bar most men in their late 20s and early 30s have cleared either. Taken together, financial section alone, you've already excluded the majority of men in the relevant age range. But I kept reading. The emotional availability section was the one that required the most rereads. Must be emotionally present and available at all times. But also must fully respect her need for space without seeking reassurance or clarification. Must initiate quality time consistently throughout the relationship, but must not come across as needy or emotionally dependent. Must be able to process his own emotions independently without burdening her, but also must be open and emotionally vulnerable with her whenever she needs that from him. I read that section probably 4 times, not because the individual sentences were hard to understand, but because taken together, they required the man to be in 2 different emotional states simultaneously, available and vulnerable when she needed that, independent and non-needy when she needed that instead. Without being told which mode was required at any given moment, and without asking for clarification about which mode was required, because asking for clarification would indicate emotional immaturity. I moved on to the political alignment section. Must identify explicitly as a feminist, not just sympathetic to feminist ideas, but actively identifying. Must have voted correctly in the last 2 major elections. Must actively engage with social justice content online and be able to demonstrate this engagement if asked. Must not maintain close friendships with anyone holding what she described as retrograde views on gender, race, or social progress. That last item had a footnote explaining that retrograde was defined broadly, and she would assess on a case-by-case basis, meaning she could decide retrograde meant whatever she needed it to mean whenever the question came up. Lifestyle compatibility section. Vegan or actively transitioning to veganism with a clear and documented timeline. No video games. She specified in parentheses that this was completely non-negotiable. no participation in what she called bro culture activities, with a list of examples including fantasy sports leagues, regular poker nights, watching sports in bars, and any group male bonding activity that excludes women by culture, even if not by explicit rule. Must prioritize the relationship above personal ambitions when circumstances require it. I stopped on that one again. Must prioritize the relationship above personal ambitions when circumstances require it. No timeline specified for when that prioritization would be required. No clarity on who decides when circumstances require it. I filed it away. The document ended with a short paragraph explaining that this list wasn't about finding perfection. It was about alignment, and a man who was truly secure in himself would see this list not as a burden, but as a gift, because it removed all uncertainty about compatibility. Below the paragraph, she had added the caption for posting publicly. I know my worth. These aren't demands, they're standards. A high-value man won't even flinch. I put my phone down and went to sleep. Woke up to a significantly larger number of messages than usual. The post had been picked up overnight by a large meme account. They'd reposted the document title and several highlighted items with the caption, 73 Reasons to Stay Single. That single repost had more engagement by the next morning than anything Morgan had ever posted in her entire time running the blog. The comments were mostly men. Some wrote short things like nope or Mao or good luck with that, Godspeed. Some went through the list item by item and wrote responses to each requirement. The zero student loan debt item generated its own thread of guys doing the math on what percentage of American men in their 30s actually have no student debt. The income threshold got similar treatment. Someone posted actual census data on median male incomes by age bracket. The emotional availability section got screenshotted separately and posted around with the comment that reading it felt like being asked to be both hot and cold simultaneously. Some women commented too. A portion were supportive, said she knew her worth, told her not to compromise for anyone. Said, finally, a woman who is honest about what she wants. Others were more hesitant, said things like, this is a lot, or maybe some of these could be flexible. One woman left a fairly long comment saying she identified as a feminist herself and absolutely believed in women having high standards, but that 73 non-negotiable items formatted like a compliance document was going to make genuine connection very difficult. That comment got argued with at length by several people in the replies. By the afternoon, Morgan had posted her response. Said that the fact that men were reacting this way to a woman knowing what she wants told everyone everything they needed to know. Said this was exactly why the list existed. Said fragile masculinity was on full display. That post got a solid number of likes from her existing followers. It also got ratioed, which means the replies significantly outnumbered the likes, meaning most of the reply activity was not agreement. She did not address the ratio publicly. I came into work the next day expecting her to be either defensive or quiet. She was neither. She was energized in the same way she'd been the morning she wrote the list, talked at lunch about how the reaction proved she had hit something real, said when a woman is direct and explicit about her needs, men panic because society conditions them to expect women to be grateful for any interest they receive. Said the pile-on was evidence of a systemic problem, not evidence that the list itself was wrong. I said something careful about whether some of the pushback might be less about her having standards and more about the specific volume and format of them. She looked at me, then said men never get asked to justify their preferences the way women do. Said a man who exclusively dates tall women or women with a specific body type never gets an article written about him. I acknowledged there was probably a genuine double standard in how society responded to women being explicit about their requirements versus men doing the same thing. She accepted that acknowledgement and moved on. I did not bring up the emotional availability section. I had made a decision that that particular internal contradiction was not mine to point out. In an open plan office, you survive by being selective about what you engage with, so I let it go. What I noticed, though, privately, was that she had posted 73 requirements for someone else and had not once in any of these conversations described herself. Not her personality, not what she brought, not what it was like to spend time with her. Just the list, and then the reactions to the list, and then her reactions to the reactions. It was like the document had become the whole conversation, and she was defending the document instead of herself. Over the following weeks, things developed in the way I had privately expected them to develop. She updated her dating app profiles, changed her bio to communicate that she had standards and wasn't interested in people who weren't serious. She started sending the list to matches before agreeing to meet them. She mentioned this to me, said it was the most efficient approach because it removed the possibility of wasting time on incompatible people. She seemed pleased with the logic of this. I noticed, without saying anything, that the number of matches she mentioned had decreased considerably. The first guy who agreed to a date after receiving the list showed up, had coffee with her for somewhere around 20 minutes, and left. She told me he was intimidated by a woman who was direct and clear. She said this with a satisfaction that I found genuinely hard to parse. Like the early exit was proof that the system worked correctly. The list had identified an incompatible person and removed him from consideration. She framed it as a success. I thought about pointing out that a man leaving a date early is not normally what success looks like, but I did not point that out. The second date was roughly similar in structure. She had apparently gone through some of the more important requirements out loud over coffee. Not all 73, just the ones she considered foundational. I don't know exactly which ones she led with, but the guy had listened, finished his coffee, and then told her he thought he had left something on at home. Stood up and left while she was mid-sentence, apparently. She seemed genuinely unbothered by this when she told me. Said he had physically fled from accountability, which became her phrase for it. She posted about this one publicly, said she'd been on a date, and the man had fled the moment real expectations were introduced. Said it was the clearest possible evidence of why the list existed in the first place. A number of her followers told her she was better off without men like that. A roughly equal number of other people had different views about what the anecdote demonstrated. The screenshots ended up on several forums where men were discussing dating. I got sent them again by different people. She did not engage with those forums directly. There was a third date that she mentioned briefly. This one had lasted longer. A guy she said seemed promising at first. They got through the coffee, and then she described how she had eventually brought up the political alignment section. Asked about his voting history. He had apparently gotten very quiet, and then said something about preferring to keep that private, which she had taken as a red flag. She had ended the date there. She said a man who was truly aligned wouldn't be private about his politics. I asked whether it was possible he was just a private person in general. She said that in this political climate, privacy on that topic was itself a position. I let that one go too. I had developed a very comprehensive internal catalog of things I was letting go. It was getting long. A podcast reached out sometime in this general period. A smaller feminist-leaning show, probably a few thousand regular listeners. They wanted to interview her about dating standards and the public reaction the list had generated. She accepted immediately and was noticeably energized about it for the following week. Mentioned it at work a few times in the days before the recording. Said it was an opportunity to have a real substantive conversation about the social dynamics at play. specifically about why men reacted so strongly and defensively when women were explicit about needing things. Said the mainstream conversation always focused on whether the woman was being reasonable, instead of asking why men found female standards threatening in the first place. I nodded. She went and recorded the episode and came in the next day describing how well it had gone. Said the host was great, asked genuinely good questions, actually listened to her answers. Said it felt like finally being in a conversation with someone who understood the framework she was working from. The episode came out a few days later, and she shared it everywhere. I listened to a portion of it during my commute. She was articulate, I'll give her that. She made her points clearly. She talked about toxic masculinity being the underlying structural reason that men refuse to engage with women who have explicit standards. Talked about how the cultural conditioning of men leads them to expect women to be grateful for whatever attention they receive, so when a woman arrives with actual stated requirements, it triggers a defensive response rooted in insecurity. Said the meme coverage the list had received was itself a perfect demonstration of that dynamic in action. The host agreed with each point as it came up. The conversation had a very specific shape, where both participants were confirming things to each other rather than testing them. I recognize the shape of it. It's a common shape. You get into a conversation where the goal stops being to find out if something is true and becomes about demonstrating that you already knew it was true. Both people leave feeling validated, and nothing actually gets examined. I finished the commute and went to work. The comments under the podcast episode were not what I would describe as uniformly supportive. Some were. Her regular followers showed up and engaged positively, but a significant portion were from people who disagreed. Some were dismissive. Some were mean in the way internet comments often are. Some were longer and actually tried to engage with the argument she was making. One comment that got a lot of replies was from a man who said he had no problem with a woman knowing what she wanted, but that the specific framing of 73 non-negotiable items sent before a first meeting communicated something about trust rather than standards. Said it signaled that she had already decided most men were going to disappoint her before she'd given any of them a chance to be a real person to her. That comment got both agreed with and argued against extensively. I saw her reading the comments section at her desk one afternoon. She had a specific expression that I recognized from other contexts, the expression of someone who had expected a certain reaction and was sitting with a different one. She closed the browser after a few minutes and went back to her actual work without saying anything about it. I didn't say anything either. We had reached a point in the whole situation where any comment I made was going to land badly, regardless of what it was. If I said the comments were rough, I was piling on. If I said some of them had a point, I was betraying her. If I changed the subject, it was dismissive. So I said nothing, which was the cleanest available option. I had gotten good at identifying the cleanest available option and taking it. Things settled down over the following weeks the way online moments do. Some other story came along and the meme accounts moved on. The list was still up. She hadn't taken it down, but nobody was reposting it anymore. The comment sections went quiet. The forum threads got buried. At work, she still mentioned dating sometimes at lunch. A match that had started promising, but then said something that revealed a political misalignment. She'd asked at some point, and he had given an answer she considered disqualifying. She seemed resigned rather than upset, like this was expected. A guy who seemed great on paper, but mentioned he had friends she described as problematic. I asked in what way problematic. She said he'd referenced a guy's trip they had taken together recently, and one of the other guys on the trip held views she didn't agree with. I said something about whether someone could be held responsible for their friend's views. She said the company you keep says something about you. I nodded. One guy she'd actually gotten to 2 dates with before he mentioned he had a gaming PC at home. 2 dates, which was the furthest the list era had gotten. She said she'd thought about being flexible on that one. Said maybe gaming was something that could evolve. But then he mentioned some online gaming community he was part of, and she said the community had a reputation she didn't like. So that was that. The framing for all of these was always consistent. The man had failed to meet the standard. The list had done what it was designed to do. She had been protected from incompatible people. I nodded through all of it. I had developed what I can only describe as a professional-grade nodding capability. It had become automatic, reliable, and completely decoupled from my actual internal response. It is genuinely a skill that develops over time in the right environment. The thing I noticed, but didn't say, was that the list was generating a very specific kind of outcome. It was producing an endless series of men who had failed. An endless series of close calls that were resolved by disqualification, and each disqualification was processed as confirmation that the list was necessary. Every man who left early was intimidated. Every man who didn't meet a financial threshold was proving that high standards were being tested. Every man who had a gaming setup or the wrong friends was correctly filtered out. There was no version of the list's operation that could produce evidence against the list. Any outcome became evidence for it. I thought about this but did not say it. It was not my list, and it was not my romantic life. There was one afternoon where she was in a noticeably quieter mood. I didn't ask about it directly. But later she said something about how she'd looked at her dating app and realized she hadn't had a new match in over 2 weeks. Said the algorithm was probably suppressing her profile because of low activity. I didn't mention that most apps' algorithms are driven by how often people like you back. I just said those apps had weird mechanics sometimes. She agreed and said she was thinking about switching platforms. I said that seemed reasonable. She said maybe she would try one of the ones that was more focused on serious relationships. I said sure, that made sense. She didn't mention it again after that. Then there was a completely ordinary afternoon. Nothing notable about the day, just a regular workday. I was walking back from the printer with some documents and past her desk. Her laptop was open and the Google Doc was on screen. She had stepped away. I could hear her talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to read the list again. I had already read it entirely. Didn't need a second pass. But I slowed down for just a second, not because of the list itself. I thought of a question, a simple one. She came back with her coffee and saw me standing near her desk. Didn't seem bothered or suspicious, just settled into her chair and glanced at her screen. I said something before I had fully composed the sentence in my head. Asked whether she had ever written down what she brought to a relationship with the same level of detail that she'd written down what she needed from one. Not sharply, just as a genuine question. A kind of quiet observation more than anything. She looked up at me. There was a pause. I had expected an immediate response. She usually had one ready. Something about how women are always asked to justify themselves while men's preferences go unexamined, or how the question itself reflected the problem she was describing. But she didn't say anything immediately. I hadn't planned what I would say after the question, so I just picked up my papers and went back to my desk. The rest of that afternoon was quiet in a specific way. We both just worked. She didn't bring it up before she left for the day. I didn't either. The following week moved at its normal pace. She didn't mention dating at lunch. She talked about a project she was working on, a campaign that was behind schedule. Complained about a meeting that had started late and then run long. Asked if I wanted anything from the sandwich place when she went. Normal lunch conversation. But the dating topic was just not present. I noticed that absence more than I expected to. It had been a consistent feature of our lunch conversations for months, and suddenly it just wasn't there. Not replaced by anything, just absent. A couple weeks after the printer moment, she stopped at my desk on a Friday afternoon. Most people were already wrapping up or had left early. She didn't sit, just stood at the edge of my desk. Said she'd been thinking about the question I asked, about the other list, about her half of the equation. Said she had actually tried to write it. Sat down one evening and attempted to build a list of what she offered in the same format and level of detail as the requirements list. I just listened. She looked at the window instead of at me. Said the list was shorter than she had expected it to be. Said some of the things she had written as her positive attributes were not consistent with what she was asking for from someone else. Gave one example. She'd written that she was independent and focused on her career as a positive quality she brought to a relationship. But item 30-something in the requirements list asked that a man prioritize the relationship above personal ambitions when circumstances required it. Sat there and realized she was asking for something from someone else that she wasn't offering in return. I said that was probably a useful thing to notice. She said, yeah, probably. Then she said something I hadn't expected. Said there was a line in the requirements about the man needing to be emotionally available and open. And she'd been thinking about a guy she dated a few years back, before the list, and before all the online stuff. Said he had been open with her, shared things with her, was pretty expressive about how he was feeling. Said she remembered finding it exhausting at the time, thinking he was too much, too emotionally present, too frequently in his feelings about things. Said she had pulled away from him partly because of that. And then, years later, she'd written emotional availability as a non-negotiable requirement. And sitting there trying to write her own list, she'd made the connection between those two things. I didn't know exactly what to say to that, so I said something about how patterns in your own behavior are usually the last things you clearly see. She said, yeah. Then she said she was going to think about which items on the list were genuinely about compatibility and which ones were about something else. She didn't say what the something else was. Didn't need to. She grabbed her bag and left. I sat there for a few minutes after the office had mostly emptied out. Not doing anything in particular, just sitting. A couple weeks later, she mentioned at lunch that she'd removed the list from her dating profiles. Not taken it off the internet entirely. It was still up, but stopped sending it to matches proactively. Said she was just talking to people first now, letting things develop before establishing formal compatibility. I said that seemed like the more reasonable approach. She said it was uncomfortable because it meant sitting with uncertainty for longer. Said she kept catching herself wanting to send the list just to know faster whether someone was aligned, but she was trying to stay with the discomfort instead of resolving it prematurely. I said that was probably the harder version of the process, but likely the more accurate one. She said, yeah, probably. A month or so after that, she mentioned going on a date. Briefly, in passing, not a big announcement. Said it had gone fine. The guy seemed normal. I asked what she meant by normal. She said it felt like just talking to someone, rather than managing an interaction. Like she wasn't running assessments the whole time, she was just there having a conversation. I said that sounded like a positive sign. She said it was strange, because he didn't meet a significant number of requirements from the old list. Lower income than the threshold, rented his apartment, had a gaming setup in his bedroom. I said that was interesting. She said yeah. Didn't elaborate further on the requirements list. Just said the date had been fine and she was seeing how it went. I don't know how it went. She hasn't updated me, and I haven't asked. We still sit near each other, still get lunch sometimes. She still has her blog, still writes about the things she cares about, still mentions her follower count occasionally. The specific moment with the list has just settled into the background of regular office life. It happened. It was a thing. And then time moved forward the way it does. Nobody wrote a follow-up piece about what changed. No one came back to the original post to check in. The meme account that got 40,000 reposts on the initial share has since moved on to 17 other viral moments. That's how these things work. The list is still technically up on the internet if you know where to look, but the conversation around it is dead. I think about it now and then, not in a heavy way, just as an example of something. Morgan spent a few months constructing something she thought was a filter, and finding out it was more like a wall. The irony is she already knew how to connect with people. She's not broken in that way, not incapable of real conversation or genuine warmth. She's actually pretty decent company when she's not in defense mode. She just got convinced at some point that the way to find the right relationship was to make the requirements explicit enough that incompatibility became impossible to miss before it cost her anything. What she didn't think through was that the requirements themselves became the thing people were responding to, not her personality, not what it would actually be like to spend time with her, not whether she was kind or interesting or worth knowing. Just a formatted document with 73 numbered items, and whatever the document was supposed to communicate about her values ended up communicating something different to almost everyone who read it. The list was supposed to say, "I know what I want, and I respect my own needs." It read like, "I've already decided you're probably going to fail." Those are different things. I'm not saying having standards is wrong. Most people have things they genuinely need in a relationship, and those things are legitimate. I'm saying a 73-item non-negotiable compliance checklist sent to strangers before meeting them in person is a different posture toward the world than just knowing what you need. It's treating a potential relationship like a contract, where the other person hasn't been offered a seat at the negotiating table yet. It's optimizing for not being hurt so aggressively that it prevents anything from starting. The list wasn't really about finding someone. It was about finding a reason not to be found. Every requirement was a test that the man could fail. And failing was safe, because failing meant he was never really inside the wall in the first place. He never got close enough to hurt anyone. I think somewhere underneath the spreadsheet logic was someone who had been hurt before and had decided that the way to prevent it from happening again was to make the entry process so rigorous that nothing bad could get through. The problem with that logic is that nothing else can get through either. Anyway, that's more analysis than I usually do about things that happen at my workplace. The short version is Morgan made a list. The internet laughed at the list. The list didn't work in the way she intended. And then she had one quiet conversation with herself about what she was actually bringing, and things started to loosen up a little. I said one thing while walking past her desk. Didn't plan it, didn't follow up on it, didn't make it into a big conversation. Apparently that did more than 3 months of viral attention and a podcast appearance had done. Make of that what you want. I still work 2 desks down from her. We still get lunch. She still talks before I've had enough coffee. She mentioned the other day that she was thinking of writing something new for the blog. Not about the list, about something else. I said that sounded good. She said, yeah, she wanted to write about something she actually had more to say about. I said, what was that? She paused and said she wasn't sure yet. She was still figuring it out. I said that seemed like a reasonable place to start. Some things don't change. MW. One unplanned question quietly moved something that nothing louder had touched. Be well out there, anon.